In the decade before the Revolutionary War here in America, the seeds of similar revolutions were being planted by the modern Enlightenment all over Europe. The very dramatic social reform that we saw in the French Revolution actually took place after we, as the British colonies in the Americas, had won our independence, but that movement had been gaining steam for a generation. There are always those who resist substantive change. Albert Einstein said that great spirits have always found violent opposition from mediocre minds. The latter cannot understand it when a person does not thoughtlessly submit to hereditary prejudices, but honestly and courageously uses their intelligence. But when you question the basic assumption of a society's mythology, you can expect the opposition to be fierce. On the first day of July, 1766, a decade before our Declaration of Independence, the Parliament in Paris carried out the torture, beheading, immolation, and scattering of ashes. They really hated this guy because they cut his head off and then set him on fire and then scattered his ashes. 19-year-old man, the Chevalier de la Barre. He was charged. Well, he refused to doff his hat in the presence of communion wafers, and he sang some bawdy songs. But the number one offense for which he was executed was because he was found to be in possession of this book, Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary. Voltaire published this book 250 years ago, and it was almost immediately the target for both church and government book burnings. I would hazard a guess that it is not a favorite read among government officials today, and I doubt that it would be found in any church libraries or offices in our town other than ours. Voltaire challenged the authority of the church and the authority of the royal family, both in his plays, Candide being the most familiar, and in his books. And because that way of thinking challenged the existing social order, he had to live in virtual exile to avoid execution. Now, perhaps we are less likely to torture, behead, burn, and scatter the ashes of free thinkers in our day, but believe me, corporations, the media, the government, and the institutional church still have ways of silencing opposition, some of which makes beheading sound kind of inviting sometimes. But at least for us, this voice of common sense, of critical thinking, not only does not pose a threat, but we can look to him for inspiration. He did not want to do away with religion. He was not an enemy of faith. He just wanted religion to become sane, for it to embrace intelligence. He preferred for religious instruction to teach morality rather than dogmatic beliefs, to teach behaviors rather than beliefs. He thought that being a churchgoer should help people to be more just, not just more absurd. He said that the church should not order one to believe in things that are impossible, contradictory, injurious at least to the reputation of the divine, and pernicious to what it means to be a human being. He added that we shouldn't threaten people with eternal torment for thinking rationally about these things. I was recently asked by Barbara, my friend Barbara, to preside at the funeral of her brother. And he had never been a churchgoer, but he had read my newspaper columns for years, and really isn't that about the same? So I was as close to a pastor as he had, and Barbara asked me to come and do the service, and I was honored to do it. But what I did at the funeral was I spoke about Dick's beliefs rather than the common beliefs of the community. I spoke about his personal choice to do exactly what Voltaire had suggested. Dick gave 5 years of his life working among the poor in Appalachia, then came back to Springfield, bought a bookstore on Commercial Street, and spent his entire career trying to get kids from our most impoverished schools to set down the comic books and actually read real books to promote their education. He just didn't have much use for formal religion or the institutional church. Now, you all have been to enough Ozark funerals to know the routine. Some people want to keep the casket open, and the tradition is at the end of the service, the minister goes and stands at the head of the coffin, and everyone solemnly files by and shakes hands with the minister, and then you go to the interment. At this funeral, though, the first person out of her chair was a little white-haired lady. I was prepared for compliments, as what I normally expect, but she grabbed my hand, pulled me down where she could say right into my ear, "I think you're a F-bomb idiot." And I'm relatively certain that Jesus must have been very, very proud of her for her eloquent defense of traditional religious views. But people often have extremely angry reactions to having their mythology challenged. You don't tend to like the person who opens your eyes to a deeper reality. There was a research project recently published in the July issue of Cognitive Science that showed that children who are not exposed to religious training, the kids that don't go to church, are better able to tell the difference between reality and imagination than the ones that do go to Sunday school. And I'm actually sorry that they didn't conduct the research on adults, because it seems to me that traditional religion skews the ability of many grown-ups to be able to tell the difference between what is in their imagination and what is actually true. I've talked a lot about evidence-based faith here for several years, about discarding magic and superstition in favor of what can rationally be known and intelligently discussed. But it's not just religion that participates in irrational superstition. Politics does too. There is such a thing as an American myth that is often obvious to the people who live in other nations when they're looking at us, but it's oftentimes not obvious to us at all. There was a tragic event this week on Thursday that's been heavily reported in the news, as if the Malaysian Airlines needed any other catastrophe after losing an airplane in March that's never been found. One of their planes was shot down while flying over the Ukraine. And I have heard reports on every kind of media and TV and newsprint and on the radio as people have speculated about whether this was the fault of Russia itself or the government of the Ukraine, or the apparently much more likely guilty parties being the insurgents in the Ukraine. I've heard a lot of anger about how irresponsible Vladimir Putin was to have armed these insurgents, many of our news agencies of which are describing these insurgents to make it sound like a parent who gave their 13-year-old the keys to the family car and gave him a case of beer and some fireworks to go along with it. What I have not heard referenced yet in any of these news reports from Thursday until this morning is any mention of the fact that our highly trained, very professional Navy on board the USS Vincennes that was illegally in Iranian waters in the Persian Gulf in 1988 shot down an Iranian passenger commercial jet with nearly 300 deaths. I mean, most of us here are old enough to remember that event, and yet we are shocked and offended that some Russian sympathizers have done the exact same thing that we did. Do you remember what sanctions were leveled against the United States when we did that? Do you remember any international hue and cry to punish us for this? I mean, there's been more than a dozen commercial planes shot down over places of conflict in the last 30 years. I'm not trying to say that this was okay. I'm not trying to whitewash this at all. And the United States certainly was a better player. The United States immediately admitted, oops, we made a mistake. We shot down a commercial airline, and we made financial reparations to the survivors. It took us about 25 years, but we did do it. Soviet Union, or Russia rather, excuse me, China, Turkey, Israel, other countries that have shot down commercial airliners, they will typically pretend like it didn't happen. The people in the Ukraine, now appear to be destroying evidence while Russia is just looking the other way as if they don't know anything about the circumstances. But what I find lacking in the conversation in the media is any humility about the fact that we did the exact same thing. Virtually all of us here are old enough to remember it, and yet they're not even mentioning it. That's not to whitewash this incident, but in rational analysis, we have to say that these things happen when we invent these kinds of weapons and place them in places of human conflict. What we should be talking about is how to settle disputes among the nations of the world before we start passing off surface-to-air missiles to the political equivalent of drunken teenagers. Tensions have risen to a crescendo in the Gaza Strip again, provoking the firing of hundreds of totally ineffective Syrian-made rockets at Israel. Not a single Israeli has been killed because these things are so low-tech that they absolutely don't work. But the fact that they have shot them at all has provoked Israel into a very lethal and heavily armed response. Our media seems to view these things in about the same way that they covered the World Cup. They just want us to take sides, when in fact, guilt in Palestine between Jews and Hamas is pretty evenly spread. Even NPR, which I typically want to think of as being a reliable news source. I don't know if you all listen to the podcast of Intelligence Squared, but they do a news-relevant debate on this NPR podcast that's typically really good. But they ran one this week that was a debate between a Jewish attorney and a representative of Hamas to say which one of them was behaving like a terrorist. Now, the irony is that the actual debate took place in 2006, but they were just airing it again this week because it's the exact same problem. 8 years old, and they could run it as if it was a debate that they conducted in their studios this week because they're both still just pointing at each other and saying it's the other guy's fault. The conflict between Israel and Hamas is not a religious problem. It's a real estate problem. And it's a real estate problem that gets expressed in religious language. The conflict in the Ukraine is not about culture or language. It's about economic control issues. It's about the distribution of crude oil and natural gas. That's all it's really about. The pipelines that run crude oil and natural gas from Russia go through the Ukraine, and that's what this battle is really about. So the real resolution of historical wars, and the United States used to fight with England, with Japan, with Germany. How did they become our closest allies? It wasn't because we beat each other on the battlefield. It was because we developed economic links. It was trade, commerce that actually turned us into partners. Imagine if we applied that logic to Cuba. If we began to just have open free trade with Cuba, how the actual changes would take place in Cuba. Imagine what could have been done to resolve the real estate problem in Palestine if we had spent 1/10 as much money on the real problem as we have spent on military solutions when there really is no such thing as a military solution. Problems are not solved on a battlefield. Money gets spent and people get killed, but it doesn't ultimately solve the problem. Voltaire asked his countrymen to give up on a religion that required executioners to enforce their dogma, and that inundated the earth with blood, fighting over entirely unintelligible religious claims. So before you think about beheading, burning me, scattering my ashes, I'm just saying, why don't we give rational thought a chance?
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.